My name is Michael Fazius. I'm an associate professor at Tokyo College, the University of Tokyo. I'm going to be the moderator for today. Today's event, some of you might have seen it in the announcements on the newsletter, wherever you got this information, that this event is part of a series of 5 webinars we have been organizing here at Tokyo College on the occasion of the International Women's Day. So it's a week-long kind of program that we've been doing. And I'd also like to invite you, if you haven't seen it, to the last one that is happening tomorrow. It's called Japan Gender Update, Envisioning a Far More Female Future of Japan 2021 with Professor Shirahase Sawako and Bill Emmett. You can find the information on our website. So, and in the context of these 5 sessions that we're having, this one is specifically also related to one topic, one research theme that we have in Tokyo College, which is Japan viewed from inside and outside. So this is one reason why in this seminar we've invited non-Japanese researchers researching on not just Japanese, but also East Asian in the wider sense, masculinities. So this is one opportunity to showcase a bit the work of scholars working on these topics outside of Japan to a Japanese audience. And of course, that doesn't mean that the research of Japanese researchers in this field is not important. It's basically to be seen as a set in this 5 webinar event. And of course, hopefully this is also a starting point for conversations between also you in the audience and the researchers that are joining us today. So also before we start, when we organized this, we didn't really, we had to manage these seminars and kind of spread them out over the week. So this seminar ended up on the day of the 10th anniversary of the triple disaster in Fukushima and Tohoku, exactly 10 years ago on March 11, 2011. I think all of you who are joining here are aware of this. The big earthquake and tsunami hit this region. And I just wanted to acknowledge that at the beginning, since we are on this day, to commemorate the more than 15,000 victims of the disaster itself, the many refugees, and the social, economic, and ecological impact of that crisis that and disaster that are still going on today. So I just wanted to say that before we're starting. So let me briefly also now talk about how this webinar is structured. First, I'll very briefly introduce our speakers one by one, and then we'll have one initial round of brief introductions of everyone's research, interests, and projects. And then we'll see where the conversation leads us, but some of the topics I would like to discuss are how our panelists understand masculinity, what role does it play in their research, then also talk a bit about intersections between the research of our speakers today. And another step, we named this East Asian Masculinities. So we will also discuss comparative and transnational aspects, like what can be compared, why is in what sense is East Asia a category that makes sense. And in the final step, we will think about the contribution of our speakers' research to the field of East Asian masculinity studies, and also a bit to the extent that we have time, talk about where the field is headed in general. And since it's International Women's Day, in the last step, in the last minutes, I would also like to ask our speakers a bit about like if they feel that they can learn anything from their research that would be applicable to current societies and issues of gender equality and a more inclusive society. 会話は英語でやってまいりますが、質疑応答は日本語でも大丈夫ですので、ぜひお気軽にチャットに書いてみてください。So the Q&A button at the bottom, this is how you can interact with the speakers today. If you click on it, you see that you can add questions. I think some of you will have been in other webinars before as well. So you just add your questions or comments there. And you can also upvote other people's questions. And then we try to pick them up either directly in the conversation or at the end. Okay, that said, let's get started. And I'd like to introduce now briefly our speakers. First of all, Robert Kramm. And Robert is a historian. Hi, Robert. He's based in Germany right now, speaking to us from Germany. So it's late morning, I think. Robert is a historian, a Freigeist fellow, and a principal investigator of the research group Radical Utopian Communities at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. And his field is 19th and 20th century global history, history of everyday life, and modern Japanese history, with a combined focus on the history of the body, sexuality, anarchism, and communes. His first book, Sanitized Sex, analyzes the regulation of sexuality, sex work, and intimacy during the occupation of Japan after World War II. His second book project is a social and cultural history of the early 20th century, investigating communal life in Japan, Jamaica, and South Africa. Thank you for joining us today, Robert. Second is Yuen Shu-min. Shu-min is a postdoctoral fellow at the department. Hi, thank you for joining us tonight. Shu-min is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Japanese Studies at the National University of Singapore. And her research interests include gender and sexuality, popular culture, and mobilities and migration. Her current book project examines the lived realities of female-to-male trans men in contemporary Japan. Her recent works appeared in Asian Anthropology and Transgender Studies Quarterly. And I think, Shu-min, you are joining us from Singapore, right? Thank you very much. Next up is Nicolas Schillinger. He is joining us from Germany today, from Berlin, and he received his PhD from Heidelberg University. Right now, he's a visiting professor in modern Chinese history at Freie Universität in Berlin. And his research focuses on the history of body and gender, military history, and the history of science and knowledge. His first book deals with military reforms in late Qing and early Republican China and their effect on conceptualizing bodies and masculinity. Currently, he is working on a book manuscript on the link between science and war in Republican China, examining the role of medicine, germs, chemicals, and death rays for the Chinese army in the 30s and 40s. Thank you for joining us. Next up is Sylvia Ang. Sylvia recently completed a postdoctoral fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Her PhD, obtained from the University of Melbourne, investigated how the rise of China is affecting migrants and local social practices and cultural understandings in Singapore. Her research interests lie at the intersection of race and migration studies, including ethnicity, gender, and class, as well as racialization and racism. She has published in various journals, including the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, Gender, Place and Culture, and Mobilities. Her monograph, Contesting Chineseness, Ethnicity, Class, Gender, and New Chinese Migrants, was recently contracted by Amsterdam University Press. And Sylvia is joining us from Melbourne today, is that right? Yeah, thank you. Okay, last but not least, TRAN. Welcome. Hui is a PhD researcher at the Institute of East Asian Studies, University of Duisburg-Essen. Hui has been researching extensively about the Vietnamese migrant community in contemporary Japan and the migration channels that facilitate transnational migration between Vietnam and Japan. His current research focuses on the intersections of transnational mobilities, sexualities, and masculinities among Vietnamese migrant men in Japan. Tran's research interests also include transnationalism, brokerage and intermediaries, migrant entrepreneurship, positionality, and qualitative methods. Okay, thank you very much for joining us, and I think you can now all switch on your screens so that we can start our first round of where you briefly introduce your research. And perhaps we can go in the opposite order. So Hui, if you would like to start.
Oh, thank you, Mikael, for having me and for the very nice introductions. And hello, everybody. My name is Hui, and as Mikael has just said, I am now entering my final year of my PhD research at the University of Duisburg-Essen. My studies has a lot to do with the negotiations of sexuality and masculinity in transnational migrations. So in particular, I looked into the intersections of transnational mobilities in various terms, spatial, social, and even status mobilities, and how they intersect with sexuality and masculinity among the group of male Vietnamese migrants in contemporary Japan. So with regards to the main topic of today, masculinity, I think the topics play a very important part in my research, both theoretically and empirically. So the notion of masculinity not only points to the changing in natures of masculine subjectivities and identities as a result of transnational migrations, but also helps to inform, at least in my research, how migrations is shaped and conditioned by masculine identities. So in fact, one of the big chapters in my dissertations talk about the metaphorical image of the salmon man. So I compare Vietnamese migrant men to the salmon fish. So as many of you know, the salmon fish is a highly migratory fish. And then it is very well known for the migratory patterns of migrating to the open sea to mature and then migrate back to its home rivers or stream to basically spawn or to reproduce. And the ways in which I see Vietnamese men's trajectory is very similar. So they consider Japan as their big oceans where they would mature and grow up as men, as mature men, more independent men. So in a way, migration from Vietnam to Japan is a pathway to manhood for many of the Vietnamese migrant men here. And in Japan, they accumulate masculine capital in order to go back and then become more, let's say, more desirable men back in Vietnam when they go back. So in other words, my research is guided by the social interactions or intertwinings of mobilities and masculinities. I think you are muted, Nikhil.
Sorry. Yes, that's right. Thank you very much. Okay, next up, Shumin, could you briefly introduce what you're working on, what your interests are?
Hi, everyone. My name is Shumin from the NUS National University of Singapore Department of Japanese Studies. Thank you, Tokyo College, for inviting me to speak at this event. I wish this was held in person and then we could all fly to Japan for this event. But anyway, my current book project focuses on female-to-male transgender people in Japan, or FTM, as my informants call themselves. And in this project, I explore how Japanese trans men experience and negotiate inclusion in a society, Japan, that continues to marginalize those people who do not or cannot conform to prevailing gender and sexual norms. So I conducted fieldwork in Japan between 2013 and 2018. My fieldwork is predominantly based at this self-published FTM magazine called Love. It is the only magazine for trans men in circulation in Japan today. I've also attended numerous drinking parties, nomikai, or social events that the magazine Love organized as part of their activities, not just publishing magazine, but also organizing events and activities for trans men. So during my fieldwork, I found that most of my informants, they live what we might call double life, where they live as gender normative, so-called ordinary or 父子 men in their everyday public lives, but they also participate in social events, activities like these drinking parties that were organized by and for trans men after work or during the weekends. Very few of my informants live openly as trans. Many of them are unable to, do not wish to, or do not see a need to come out as trans in the workplace or outside of their immediate families. And in some cases, they don't even come out to their own family members. And so these people, they came out with various strategies to present themselves as gender normative, cis heterosexual men at the workplace and also in their neighborhood. But at the same time, these trans men who live as and are only known as men socially and or legally in their everyday lives, they also participate in these FTM social events like drinking parties. And in doing so, in participating in these drinking parties and social events, I feel that they carved out a space for themselves to live as trans and also for a sense of community and belonging to a collective sociality of FTM trans people without undermining their male public selves. So I argue that this dual positioning of both trans and men by my informants can be understood as a strategy for both economic survival and social membership in a society that continues to discriminate or lack proper understanding of gender and sexual non-conforming people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. Okay, next up, Nicolas.
Yes, thanks for the invitation, first of all. Nice for having me. It's very nice of you for having me. And thank you for everyone coming and joining us today. It's going to be a really interesting event, I think. So my research on masculinity basically deals with the idea or the concept of military masculinity. So what I'm interested in is how the military affects the construction of masculinity, masculinity concepts in a historical perspective. And I started to research or be interested in masculinity when I started my PhD many years ago, when I started to research the German impact on Chinese military reforms in the late Qing period. So in the very late 19th century, after the Sino-Japanese War of 1895. And then I quickly discovered that masculinity plays a big role in these reforms, because Chinese men and basically Chinese military reformers, they copied a lot of patterns, ways how men perform themselves or perform masculinity, a lot of ideas pertaining to masculinity that kind of affects these military reforms a lot. So that's what I did in my PhD, which is now published as a book, or has been published in 2016 actually already, to look into the effects of these military reforms on how masculinity changes in the late Qing period in China and the early Republican period. And I basically took that as one concept of masculinity. I think we're going to talk about that a bit in a while. So it's not the only way masculinity changes, but it's one way in the late Qing period. So there's some kind of new idea of military masculinity, but it's not the only idea of masculinity you had at the time. So, but I think we're going to talk about that in a while. And while this project about the late Qing period is basically finished, I continue to research military masculinity and how armies kind of and militaries construct or kind of contribute to construct masculinity in the Republican period. So I still work on that and try to write a paper how this changes in the long term, not only during the late Qing period, but also in the whole Republican period, even after that, in the People's Republican period, until today, basically. And currently I'm working on a paper on the very recent and very successful movie, The 800, which was a big success in China about the Sino-Japanese War. And I was invited to a film workshop to discuss this movie. And I also quickly discovered that it's a lot about masculinity in this movie. And so I'm currently working on how in this movie certain types of military masculinity are presented and are related to nationalism a lot. Okay, I think I stop here.
Thanks a lot. I just shared Nicolas' book in the chat with you, a link to the book. Also, everyone else, like if you want to share some of your work in the chat so that people can check it out, please do so. Okay, thank you very much. Next up, Sylvia.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Michael, and thanks Tokyo College for inviting me to this panel. It's a pleasure. I'm very aware that my background is very dark because it's after 8 p.m. Here in Australia. So bear with me, this is as bright as my living room gets. So with regards to my research, my primary interest is in race, to be honest. During my interviews, during my fieldwork, I realized that, especially with my low-wage male respondents, so I researched mainland Chinese migrants in Singapore, I realized that I can't actually discuss anything without taking interest in masculinity. So rather like Nicolas, realizing that there are aspects of that. So it's like when I talk about how they imagine themselves as Chinese, you cannot remove the aspect of how they imagine themselves as men as well. So that's how I got interested in Chinese masculinities. I have written a book chapter on high-wage Chinese masculinities, but also more recently, a journal article on low-wage Chinese masculinities. So I'm very interested in class and how it intersects with Chinese masculinities. I see my work as really contributing to, I think, a gap. Extant literature in migration mostly discuss masculinities in relation to migration to the West. So there's quite a bit of work, say, on Chinese masculinities in Australia, for example. And discussions of low-wage Chinese masculinities is quite limited, and the focus is on rural-urban migration within China. So I thought, oh, this is really interesting. I hope I can contribute by investigating mainland Chinese masculinities outside of China, but in a non-Western setting, which is Singapore. And I think for me, the arrival of low-wage migrants from China into Singapore's majority Singaporean Chinese population not only enables an investigation of the hierarchies of Chinese masculinities, but also unsettles the Chinese ethnic category. So by taking on the lens on masculinity, it also helps me to unsettle my primary interest of race. If that makes sense, the constructedness of Chineseness, the constructedness of race. I thought I might just mention that I use WeChat to do my research, something interesting. So especially the article on the journal article I just published on, it's called A Woman to Warm My Heart. I use WeChat to locate my researchers, but I also found later that WeChat is used by my low-wage male respondents to reimagine and reposition themselves as men by chatting to women, of course. But I think we'll talk a little bit more about that perhaps for the rest of the session. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I just shared your article also in the chat again, A Woman to Warm My Heart. So please take a look also. Okay, last but not least, for our introductory statements, we have Robert.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for having us, for organizing this, and also for Tokyo College for organizing this whole webinar series on the International Women's Day. This is fantastic. I'm very excited to be here. So as Michael just introduced me, I'm an historian, and my field is global history of everyday life, and more recently also the history of anarchism. And I do not specialize in gender studies or queer theory, yet my research and also my teaching have a combined focus on the history of the body and sexuality that are unthinkable without paying attention to intersectional analysis, which of course includes masculinity. So in my first book, Sanitized Sex, I investigate the regulation of sexuality, sex work, and intimacy during the occupation of Japan after World War II. And the book came out in 2017 with University of California Press. Methodologically and also empirically, the book contributes to the cultural and social history of the modern world by elucidating sexuality and its regulation not as peripheral issues, but as central ones during the occupation of Japan. And the sexual encounter between men of the occupation military and women of occupied Japan, as well as the spread of the narrow disease, was at the center of this very heteronormative sex regulation regime. And both occupiers and occupied, predominantly men, believed to control this through military prostitution. And military prostitution, in turn, produces and repeatedly reaffirms masculinity, and especially military masculinity, quite similar to what Nicolas has already stressed, in order to negotiate power within military organization, but also external asymmetries of power, and in this case, between occupiers and occupied. My current and second book project, Radical Utopian Communities, is a global social and cultural history of the early 20th century. And narrating this history through the lens of radical communes in Japan, Jamaica, and South Africa, it brings different communal experiments into conversation. The human body and its habits, but the very heart of radical utopians reform ideas as put into practice in communal projects that emerged all around the world. And this includes idealizing new forms of labor, living and consumption, as well as nutrition and fitness. And thus masculinity as perspective helps me to critically engage with the range, but also the limits of radical utopians' universalist claims for liberation, but they also explore commune internal power dynamics, which are arguably less fierce than in military combat and occupation units. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So I think we already have a lot of different issues to discuss, and also things that you have in common, that your research has in common. But let's perhaps go back again to this issue of what masculinity as an analytical concept, which role it plays for you. Robert, for example, just talked about masculinity as perspective. So could we talk a bit about, like, what is the analytical focus when you work with masculinity? And I don't know if anyone wants to start with some thoughts. If not, then I would perhaps ask Sylvia, if that's okay. Like, how do you conceptualize masculinity in your work?
Yeah, of course. Sorry, Michael.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. For me, I'm really interested in low-wage masculinities, and you know, because of how I'm really interested in how masculinity intersects with class. And when I look at you know, what is already written about low-wage masculinities, it's very focused on work and economics on the one hand, and then if they are talked about in other than if low-wage men are talked about in other ways, then they're always seen positioned mainly as exaggerated or hyper-masculine. And their sexual relations are portrayed as, you know, emotionally detachable and business-oriented. And I found that this was otherwise with my respondents. In fact, I mean, the important thing about migration and migrant sexuality, it's really, that's a complex and important relationship, because spatial dislocation provides opportunities for and constraints on both men and women to play out their sexualities, right? So when I study migrant men then and how they perform heterosexuality and sexual desires, I can also find out how, you know, masculinity is actually transform with migration. So I find that really useful, you know, as a race and migration scholar, to use the masculinity lens. Yeah.
So you're coming from migration studies and basically primarily, and feel that masculinity is actually a lens that can offer new connections between things that have been looked at separately so far, such as class. Could I ask Xiumin also about masculinity, because in your case also there's a connection to queer studies, obviously. So, like, what does masculinity mean in that context for you?
So I understand masculinity, or rather masculinities, as culturally and historically specific practices, behavior, attitudes that's associated with being a man, but it is also not biologically determined or fixed to male bodies. So people have talked about female masculinities. And so masculinity is constructed, it is constantly shaped and reshaped in relation to social, cultural, economic, political conditions. And I also think that masculinity is, as Cornell argues, it is a place in gender relations. So, which means that we not only need to consider masculinity in relation to femininity, but also to think about masculinity in the plural form, to think about multiple masculinities, right? Some more marginalized than others. And in many societies, including Japan, masculinities and femininities, they are organized in a hierarchy, with the form of masculinity that has the greatest ideological power as the hegemonic form of masculinity. And I think Sylvia also talks about hegemonic masculinity in her work as well, right? So hegemonic masculinity for me is one important central concept in my discussion of transgender masculinity. So So for example, in my work, I looked at how the lives of trans men are shaped by hegemonic notions of masculinity in Japan. So many scholars, Japanese studies scholars, they have argued that the white collar, middle class, heterosexually married corporate worker, as encapsulated in the image of the salaryman, can be said to be the most dominant and representative form of masculinity in post-war Japanese society. But despite claims about this model of the salaryman as the masculine ideal losing its dominance with the bursting of the economic bubble in the early 1990s, some scholars have found that the expectations and self-constructions of men and masculinity in present-day Japan continue to be informed by this hegemonic cultural ideal of the man as the husband, as the father, as the provider of the family. And my research findings also reveal that these cultural ideals of masculinity, production and reproduction also extend to and are reinforced by FDM trans people, by these trans men who try to shape their masculinity around these hegemonic ideals so that they get included into the center of Japanese society. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that's one of the key concepts in critical masculinity studies. Anyway, the idea of like hierarchies and like hegemonies of masculinity. And Hui, you've been working with these hierarchies too. I think not so much, if I understand correctly, in terms of class, but also in terms of racialization, migrant experience. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think my entry into the field of masculinity studies start with migration. So similar to Sylvia, I study migrations, and then when I talk about, and then I enter the field with the intention to study migrant sexuality and masculinity. And as I enter the domains of masculinity study, I realized that I cannot talk about masculinity without race, without war, without class. So I think from my research, I conceptualize masculinity similar to human as a plural forms, and it is context-based. It varies based on different socio-cultural contexts, and I look at how masculinity change with variances to spatiality and temporality. And with spatiality, I look at how people basically accumulate their masculine capital. What I call masculine capital is basically attributes or characteristic that allow individuals to acquire some certain status or privileges associated with manhood. So how these migrants in Japan negotiate their masculinity by, for example, working by juxtaposing their own masculinity to the masculinity of, let's say, Japanese local men. And then how they negotiate that, how they accumulate their own masculine identities in order to go back and become a more perfect man in the Vietnamese context. So what I am trying to say here is that there is also temporal dimensions to understanding masculinity, because when we talk about changing masculinities, we all know that masculinities are plurals. We all know that masculinity can be very fluid, but fluid to what extent? And fluid to basically whether it is permanently fluid or it is compromised in one way or another as a result of changing social context. And then it goes back to some form of, let's say, hegemonic masculinity, or it turns out into some other forms. And that we can only see if we consider the temporal and spatial dimensions of masculinity. So that's what I'm focusing on. And what I have found out in my research is that all of the changing in masculinity, let's say during migrations of these migrant men, are just temporary. So they compromise some part of their lost masculinity identities as a part of their migrations. And they compromise such loss in order to go back to Vietnam, and then later on with their accumulate masculine capital, turn themselves into some form of more hegemonic masculine men. So their masculinity degrade or social mobility or masculine downward mobility is just temporal. And then that's why I want to focus on the temporal and spatial variances in understanding masculinity as well. And it is very relevant in the context of migration study.
So yeah, so the Vietnamese migrants we've been researching, they're kind of accepting this downgrading in status for some time to accumulate it and go back and elevate their status back when they go back to Vietnam, right? This is kind of the idea.
Yeah, exactly. So it is basically the intersection between mobilities, different kind of mobilities. So spatial mobilities, social mobilities, and then masculine mobilities too.
It would be very nice to briefly compare in a bit also with what Silvia's findings are in that regard. First of all, but I want to ask Nicolas, he was kind of working on the opposite end of this kind of hierarchy, if you will, like hegemonic masculinity, like national even images of what it means to be a Chinese man.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a bit?
So I think the starting point of my research, whether it's about late Qing period or the current period, is always something two German historians pointed out, among others, Jürgen Matschukat and Olaf Steglitz, and they wrote that a specific thing about masculinity as compared to femininity and feminism and womanhood is that people start to talk about masculinity when there is a crisis, a real crisis or a perceived crisis. And I think that's also important for the other research here we have here. So when I look at the late Qing period, there is a crisis, there's a political, a military crisis, and then reformers and people in charge, elites, basically, they try to address this crisis, and it affects how they do political reforms or other reforms and politics, how they implement policies. And then it also affects notions of masculinity and concepts of masculinity. And so, and the other important starting point here is relationality. So how do you relate to other men in other countries or even in one society? And that's how you compare yourself, and that's what you kind of try to address when you address a certain crisis. So in the late Qing period, you have this military crisis, and then the important idea is how do we reform, can we get a better army, better soldiers, and then better men, so could serve in the army or in the military. And then you immediately have kind of people talking about masculinity implicitly or explicitly, and they try to address and they try to reform social, cultural notions and structures. And this is how kind of masculinity becomes very important. And even over time, and how you can see how it is constructed, how it permanently changes. And I think the early 20th century is for China, for Korea, for Japan is a very important period, late 19th, early 20th century, where you can see a lot of new ideas coming in, new concepts of gender in general and masculinity in particular, and where certain groups, elites, and other people try to address this crisis of masculinity they perceive. It's not necessarily real, but they kind of compare themselves to other, specifically European men or American men. And then they also have, of course, the issue of race coming in. I basically, in my research, I use that as a starting point, the idea of race, the comparison to other countries and other men. And then they kind of try to, in China or even, and also Korea and Japan, they try to copy, adopt certain ideas, certain patterns of masculinity, not something as a whole concept maybe, but how they dress, how they behave, and this kind of affects their conception of masculinity in these countries. And I think this is something that really starts in the 19th century, where you have this comparison to Europe and US, and then, but it continues until today, at least in China, where you can kind of, even in recent movies, you still have this perceived crisis. Men should men up, become more manly in a sense that is not necessarily Chinese, but rather European, where you kind of have an idea of hegemonic masculinity in the European or American sense, which does not necessarily apply to China, but this is what certain elites or people in society try to adopt and also try to establish basically in China.
Thank you.
I hope that was
That's
clear.
very interesting. Excellent. No, yeah. Let's come back to this issue of how ideas of masculinity move from one country to another a bit later. For this second round, I also wanted to ask, like right now, I want to ask everyone once, because these are kind of the basic notions in your work also, and then we just go into a deeper conversation on individual points. So I'd also like to ask Robert again about this issue, how you see masculinity, and specifically I was interested in, because you said you see masculinity as a perspective, and it's something that you find unavoidable kind of in your work. And I think that perhaps is also already a good result, right, of the work of many people having worked in masculinity studies in the last 20 years to show that it affects so many different things. It's not something similar to gender studies, which used to be also at the beginning something that was by women, for women, about women. And then at some point we all came to see that all of these intersectional things, they have to be taken into account basically in all our research that we're doing, and not just in a special niche. So I think that's a very interesting point in your work. First of all, do you want to say something about that in general? And also I'd be interested, because I mean, the two of you are historians, but you wouldn't see yourself primarily as a historian of masculinities. Can you say something about how you see the field in global history in recent years, for example, in your work? Is it something that you see not just you doing, but that masculinity becomes something that has been taken up by other researchers as well, to the extent that you can say?
Well, these are a lot of questions.
Pick one or two. You don't have to answer to everything.
Okay. No, but thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to point out that I completely agree especially what Schumann and Yuen already pointed out, and about the notion of masculinity not as a singular but as a plural phenomenon, that you have multiple masculinities, and that it's very much related to issues of hierarchy and especially of hegemony. But I'm dealing with this in a much less sophisticated way. So when I talk about in my first book, for example, where I place the management of sex at the very center of the racialized and very gendered struggle for authority and for sovereignty between Japanese occupied and American occupiers, I particularly want to shed light on rivalry, but also on complicity between Japanese and American men in their way of regulating prostitution, and particularly venereal disease and also intimacy. And in this case, and here maybe my voice as a historian comes in, because the circumstance that male voices usually dominate, especially official archives, kind of works in my favor in this regard, because a close reading of military records in particular, along the analytical category of masculinity, unearth this rivalry, for example, in bureaucratic debates about jurisdiction, about competition, about certain control or better control strategies between, but also among American and Japanese men. So it also shows that that you don't have these homogeneous blocks of Japan, America, Japanese man, American man, etc. But there's rivalry and complicity and quarrels within these administrations, if you like. So looking at these bureaucratic and political quarrels, but also particularly American soldiers bragging about their sexual adventures, but also about the fetus of venereal infections, kind of enabled me to make a stronger focus on the everyday experiences and practices of what soldiers, but also administrators, politicians, police officers, social welfare workers, ethnographers, journalists, etc., did and do during military occupations. And but I have to admit, in my current research on radical utopian communities, masculinity plays only a very subordinate role, but it nevertheless helps me occasionally to illustrate especially important moments of communal bonding. As I mentioned before, this includes labor, but also issues of fitness and nutrition, basically moments of integrative bodily practice in community building. And as such, masculinity is a great analytical tool to underscore these mechanisms of inclusion, exclusion in commune life, and which at times also allows a critical engagement with the otherwise very excessive rhetoric of solidarity and liberation. As for the field of global history and masculinity studies, I have to admit that I wouldn't know. I'm not the expert. But as you pointed out, and I think Nicolas also pointed out, there's an increasing awareness, not only of masculinity, but also of issues of gender, sexuality in general, and always in their intersection with race and class. So the field is expanding and improving, I would say.
Thank you. Okay, that concludes our first two rounds, basically, where everyone could talk a bit about their research and their understanding in general terms. First, I'd like to remind everyone in the audience that you're very welcome to use the Q&A function to ask any type of question to our speakers about their research, but also about masculinity studies in general that you'd like to discuss. And then we go as we go on, I'll be reading whatever's in the chat. So please do feel free to ask questions. Okay, so let's now talk a bit about some of the aspects that you've been bringing up in your statements earlier. So I mean, there are so many things that seem important and interesting to discuss. But one thing that I found interesting is what Nico said about crisis. Like masculinity is always discussed in crisis, and I wondered what role does crisis play in your research? Would anyone like to comment on that? Is that something that you feel is important for your actors in particular? Is it always a moment of crisis automatically, for example, in migration, or does transgender experience and trans experience in general in Japan, is it automatically something that provokes crisis? I don't know if anyone wants to start.
Can I?
Please do.
Oh, no, Sylvia, please go ahead. I think you turned on your microphone before me.
Okay, Sylvia first, then.
Thanks, Hui. Yeah, it's fine actually, but okay, I mean, I'll start then. I think thinking about the crisis, I was just thinking about how, because I focus a lot on low-wage male respondents, and there is this rhetoric of a crisis of manhood in China, especially referring to rural urban migrants, right? That they, the idea that they can't live up to the hegemonic standards of economic prowess in China. I mean, being rich is maybe a very international gold standard of being a man, of being a successful man, but especially so in China, where if you have no house or no car, you're not, there was a video, a very famous music video that went viral, and it's called the No Car, No House song. And basically a bunch of women came together to say, if you have no house, no car, get away from my side, right? You're not a man, and you're not fit to marry. So there is the crisis of manhood there. But I think what I'm interested in is that already they, for low wage male migrants, they already are in crisis in China in terms of manhood. And then they move. And then what happens to that? And in my research, I argue that, despite moving to Singapore, where they share the Chinese ethnicity as majority Singaporeans, Singaporean Chinese, they actually suffer arguably more discrimination than other migrants because of the proximity of the ethnicity. So to give an example, one of my Singaporean Chinese male respondents actually said, no, and he works with South Asian migrants, he works with Chinese, mainland Chinese migrants, and he actually said, no, the Chinese migrants are the worst because they can understand the language, they think that they can out-talk their supervisors. So he suggests that he actually treats them, he has to discipline them harder than migrants of other nationalities. So there is both a masculine issue there as well as a race issue that are clearly, right, intersectional. So I'm interested in then what this, so how their crisis translates to possibly another kind of crisis in Singapore, if that makes sense. So then, being rejected, I think, very marginalized in Singaporean society where they have very few chances of meeting Singaporean women, Singaporean Chinese women, despite sharing the same ethnicity. They have to turn to other channels, other ways to obtain intimacy, for example. So I think I'll stop there and maybe let Hui have a chance at it.
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna follow up a lot on that because we do share a lot of commonalities in our ways of doing research. But what I wanted to say was that in terms of crisis, and especially with low-wage migrants, let's say I'm working with people who are technical trainees in Japan. So in Japanese, ginoji juse. So people who basically work in low-wage sections. And with people who are having low-wage jobs, when they move, actually they do have a crisis of masculinity in terms of not only class, but also race. When Vietnamese men go to Japan, they are faced with a hierarchies of masculinity based on race. I think Robert can comment on this later because from the occupations period of Japan, the ways that Japanese masculinity is perceived is heavily influenced by Western masculinity. And that still lingers in Japanese society now today. And then as people from Southeast Asian country migrate to Japan, they are, their masculinity is basically hindered a lot based on these kind of racial hierarchies. And what I am interested in is that facing with such crisis, what do these men do to negotiate that? And the way I see it is I see masculinity as a capital. So if you see masculinity as a capital, then you can also convert different capital into achieving masculinity. Let's say if you have good economic capital, then you can, if you are a rich man, then you can turn the economic capital that you have into masculine capital. You can be considered in many contexts as a very successful man if you have great economic resources. You can also turn your cultural capital into masculine capital and vice versa. So what the migrant men in my research do is that they convert between different capitals into their own masculine capital so that they can negotiate the crisis. They spend their hard-earned money on, let's say, fancy clothes. They date a lot of Vietnamese fellow migrants in Japan as a way to negotiate their masculine crisis in migration. And the circles of masculine conversion continues not only in Japan, but also back in Vietnam when they have come back.
Thank you. Did anyone want to follow up immediately? Otherwise, I just got a very interesting comment/question that seemed to be very fitting in this context. Lan An Huang is asking, I wonder if the speakers could comment on the links between neoliberalism and masculinities. Sylvia has touched upon this in her work, but I wonder what other speakers have to say about how neoliberal ideologies and values have reconfigured masculinities across contexts. So I don't know if you want to follow up immediately. I think perhaps Nicolas also has to say something about it. But anyone, of course, any of you who wants to speak on that too. But
yeah,
perhaps
I think I could think about it. But wait,
yeah, I think
because you talked about capital. I mean,
yes. So there is it is a very important question, and thank you for asking, Lan Eng Huang. I think there is a very clear link between neoliberalisms and masculinities in terms of, for example, cosmopolitan masculinity. A lot of men shows their masculinities via the image of the modern man, of the cosmopolitan man. And that is exactly what my informants in my research capitalized on. So going back from Japan to Vietnam, they possess a symbolic capital of being the modern man of modernity, man of neoliberalisms. And because such idea is boosted by the development gap between the two countries, so when they go back from such a modernized, well, perceivedly modernized country as Japan, they would be seen as possessing a certain symbolic capital associated with neoliberalisms. And that actually helped them a lot in boosting their masculinity. I think Sylvia also have a very clear link in this regards.
So the prompt to follow up, do you, Sylvia, do you want to?
But Nicolas, did Nicolas want to add on something? I think he opened his mic just now.
Okay, please, Nicolas, please go first. I didn't see that, I'm sorry.
No, I don't really have anything to say really about that. Sorry.
I might just quickly say that thanks, Lan, for that question. I think when we think about neoliberalism, we also think about the individual taking on the responsibility, right, of the self as enterprise. And yes, I think I might say, I might say maybe all men, but I can't say that. So I think, yes, my respondents certainly do take themselves on as an enterprise. But what is interesting, in contrast to Hui's respondents, who I think he's suggesting consume conspicuously, right? My respondents, perhaps because of age as well, because they tend to be older, low-wage migrants, about in their 30s, they actually are very thrifty, and they talk a lot about thrift. So this is actually a little bit different from quite a few studies on masculinity that talk about how people spend conspicuously to regain their masculinity. And I'm talking about thrift in a sense that with my migrant respondents, they're very aware of money, certainly, so self as enterprise, as an investment. But because they have families back home, a lot of them have families back home, but they're thinking of relationships because they've been long-term in Singapore and they're lonely. They think about, oh, how much money can I spend on a woman? Not much, because I need to send back a certain amount of money back to my wife, or she'll be suspicious. They put it that way, but actually you can see that a lot of it is thinking about family harmony, and they are very proud that they value family, which is something that Suzanne Choi and Amy Peng has talked about as respectable manhood, that the value of family harmony as number one, and then even viewing money and conspicuous consumption as evil and potentially disruptive of a family's harmony. So I think that's something interesting. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think there's these two aspects. One is like economic influence, capital. The other part is also the role of the state. And I think this is something where Nicolas has perhaps a lot to say about, like the relationship, like especially in China, apparently also the state pushing a specific version of masculinity. Can you say something about that, the relation between state power, national identity, and masculinity?
Yeah, so that's quite interesting. I mean, what I'm interested in and what I research and what you can really research well in China is how kind of what is offered for an individual and the possibilities that are given are very a lot like governed by the state or by regimes. I mean, historically, it's also various institutions such as the military. And now it's very much the state and or sub-state institutions, basically, that offer a certain selection of what you can actually discover for yourself as masculinity. So you don't. So what I do basically, I study more representations and how like state actors or institutions try to govern masculinity, how they kind of offer certain things where you could select from. There's not so much choice in a neoliberal sense that you could basically, as an individual or as individuals, you kind of, you kind of choose certain things that then relate to your idea of masculinity or how you perform masculinity and so on, but rather how certain concepts, certain ideas are guided by, let's say, movies and media. So that's one thing I'm interested a little bit in right now, as I said before, where you have kind of certain types or figures of masculinity, certain ideas about masculinity, certain ideas, how do you have to perform and behave as a man, that are very much related to national interests or state interests, and where you have kind of a larger ideological issue behind that. So I wouldn't say that Chinese men in the PRC don't have a choice. They have a lot of choice, of course, and we talked about the notion of multiple masculinities, and there are of course, multiple masculinities and various concepts of masculinity in China in the PRC, but then there's also the state's interest, and you can see that it pops up every other year, that there's a discussion in the Chinese media about Chinese boys are not manly enough, and no one really knows what that means. Are they not sporty enough or not competitive or whatnot? So there's always this discussion in the Chinese media every other year, and it's also kind of state related. But what is state related is that they kind of present to you certain ideas about masculinity, and you can also see again how this is related to the military, to military reforms in China right now, where you can have this rhetoric of a stronger nation, and this also affects then how people should actually conceptualize their masculinity. So, stop here.
Thank you. Robert, if I can ask you, I think your work is very interesting in that regard, because your previous project had a similar focus as Nicolas, in the sense it was top down. It was how the state regulates, mostly in your case, sexuality, but of course connected to that also masculinity. In your new work, it's kind of the opposite. It's kind of a bottom-up approach of how communal life organizes, creates, shapes forms of masculinity. Do you want to comment on either of these two, or how perhaps if they even interrelated when you conceptualize the second project in some way in your thinking?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if I'm actually answering your question, but there's a connection between the two projects that are related to masculinity and that are related to issues of crisis and masculinity that Nicolas and the other panelists already talked about. And that is, in my case, masculinity is always entwined with empire. And by this I mean that masculinity as a construct, as a performance, as a practice, however you want to call it, is always a very power-laden principle or ordering principle for imperial formations, but only colonial and post-colonial settings, basically. And there has been some great research on arguing that empires, to quote a title from a book that came out, was edited by Fischer-Tini and Christine White, that empires were always on the verge of a nervous breakdown. So it's basically, they were always in crisis somehow. And I think masculinity, and particularly in relation to sexuality and to, let's say, moral panics that were repeatedly dominating public discourse and also administrative strategies and basically colonial rule, was a running trope, and that is was historically in many cases related to deviant, or what was called deviant sexualities, and that involved sex work, that involved homosexuality, but and also venereal disease as kind of like the fear of infection, etc., which then forced almost all these male colonial rulers and imperial leaders to develop programs to avoid this. And so there's kind of like this running trope of crisis, but I would maybe not prefer, but also bring in the idea of fragility in when it comes to masculinity in these debates, because when we usually talk about masculinity, we tend to connect it directly to issues of male dominance, of patriarchy, which are issues that I don't want to dispute at all, but it sometimes might overshadow that masculinity is, first of all, has a history, I'm saying it, and as a historian, that is made in and through history, and also it can also end. It doesn't have to. It's not a natural given, right? It is fragile. It always needs work. It needs people paying attention to it, working it, performing it, reaffirming it, etc., etc. So there's always a possibility for interruption and to break with it. So therefore, I think this idea of crisis is a very very productive and very fruitful approach to think about masculinity.
Thank you for pointing that out. I think that's an important point, especially it's something that I've also thought often doing global history, for example, that national history, many people have kind of perpetuated this notion that the nation is kind of invincible, both as a thought process and as a real institution. And then similarly, kind of through stressing male dominance in research, the focus of research being male dominance kind of reproduces also kind of this notion in a way. So like focusing on not just fragility, but also on different forms and not just a dominant hegemonic form of masculinity. I think this is a very important point to stress. Shumin, I wanted to ask you also if you could reply to either of these questions that we just had, either in terms of the bottom-up approach that you also have, in a sense, working with new types of masculinity created inside the communities, right? Of course, that they're like still culturally dominant ideas of masculinity, but these are kind of created in these groups through these magazines, through forms of communality, if you want to say something about that. And then we have two questions coming up from our audience.
Yeah, sure. I see it as kind of like an intersection between top down and bottom up, because sex reassignment surgery in Japan was legalized in 1996, 1997, and then transgender people, they are allowed to legally change their gender from 2004. So state regulation led to the possibility of people changing changing their gender, returning to the gender that they think they belong to. But at the same time, most of my informants do not follow the state-defined pathways towards gender reassignment. So many of them chose to go to Thailand for their surgeries, partly because of the opening up of Thailand to medical tourism in the late 1990s following the Asian financial crisis. So Thailand started to invest in the medical tourism industry, and also because of the better skills of the doctors in Thailand, according to my informants, and also because it's cheaper than having surgeries in Japan. So many of my informants, they travel to Thailand for their surgeries, be it top surgery or bottom surgery or other forms of surgeries. Often they engage an agent or a broker to bring them to Thailand for the surgery. The agent or broker will they will organize and arrange everything for them, from air tickets to hotels to hospitals to translators, and even a day trip to outskirts of Thailand for traveling. So in a sense, there is some kind of a free choice here, right? They choose which agents to go to, which hotels, which airline, or what forms of surgeries, what combinations of surgeries that they want at different price tag. But at the same time, they're also subjected to the sort of manipulation of the agents and brokers, who also do have something to gain from this business of bringing people to Thailand for surgeries. So I see this, a mix of state regulation allowing for this particular group of people to exist, transgender people as trans subjects to exist, but at the same time pushing them because of these strict regulations and exclusions that come out of these regulations, push them towards looking for alternatives, and then therefore the emergence of these groups of agents and brokers who sort of economically benefit from doing this kind of business of bringing people overseas. So well, these trans people, they sort of embody the what Sylvia was talking about, these enterprising subjects in the neoliberal context, right? They decide what to do with their bodies. They treat their bodies as projects, and then they and those with more money will be able to do more fancy projects than those with less resources and money. Yeah, so it's a mix of state regulation and this individual choice, I would say, and also the market as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Can I ask you a quick follow-up question based on a comment from the audience again? Lan An Huang had a follow-up question. I think that just fits in here very well with what you said. It's a question about the performance of masculinities, and you've been talking about choice, about what to do with their bodies. But the question is here, is there a particular form of masculinity, such as hegemonic breadwinner masculinity, that they aspire to live up to, or an alternative mosaic form of masculinity, and why? If you could quickly, briefly respond to that.
So I looked at all the back copies of the magazine, the trans male magazine that I was talking about, Love. So I noticed that about close to half of the magazine, every issue of the magazine, almost 50% of the content was dedicated to discussing work and the trans men's relationship with their partners. And in most cases, the partners are cisgender women, self-identified cisgender women. And then the section on work focuses on interviews by the editor with the reader models on their work life, what sorts of occupations they are in, have they come out to their bosses and colleagues, and if so, what happens after that. So there's a strong focus on work and also on heterosexual coupledom or marriage. And so I asked the editor why such focus on work and also these heterosexual relationships. And this is what he said. Let me read you this short interview data. So he said, you don't expect men past their 30s to remain as freeters or part-timers in Japanese, right? You wonder how they're going to get married. If one is a real man, one should be more practical and find work, even if they're employed as a woman. As long as one is properly employed, it doesn't matter how much one earns. So here we see the twin pillars of hegemonic masculinity in post-war Japan, work and marriage, coming through very clearly in the editor's interview statement. So to be considered a man, at least in the eyes of the editor, one needs not only to have a job as such, but to have a full-time stable job. So you cannot be a freeter, you need to have a full-time stable job like the salaryman. And also one's ability to get married depends on one's ability to find gainful employment, right? Those part-timers will have difficulties finding a spouse, according to the editor. So the magazine sort of highlights and reproduces the importance of work and marriage in the definition of masculinity for trans men, I would say. So I hope that very quickly answers the question.
Thank you very much. And then we have another question. It is a bit broader informed by Kawashima Kumiko-san. I'd like to ask the panelists about what they observed in terms of the relationship between masculinity and femininity in their research. Do you notice anything different from the past, for example? I think the past development, that's one aspect, but like, does femininity play a role in your research explicitly as well? Is there anyone who could say something about that? Or are you focusing mainly on men? Robert?
Yeah, I could say a few words about this. Well, femininity has plays an immensely role in not so much in my research, but for the historical actors I'm looking at, because they would perceive, and particularly in my research on my first book on sex work in occupied Japan, their logic would say that femininity is always vulnerable, and they would place the whole sex regulatory regime basically was to save what was called respectable reproductive sexualities, which was basically the female womb, as kind of the pure birthplace of the Japanese nation, of the Japanese empire, etc., that is now under threat from the invading occupation army. And that was one of the key notions of why Japanese administrators would implement a system of military prostitution to cater the to the occupation military, basically. So femininity is always in the background, basically, as an underlying logic and working through these regulatory regimes and practices.
Okay,
Yeah, I also have a few words to say about the relationship between masculinity and femininity. The way that I see it is that there is a transitions from, so in the past, we talk about the constructions of masculinity as mainly dominance, dependent on rejecting what is considered as feminine. But now the way that I'm seeing is that there is the transitions from rejecting to also embodying certain feminine aspects or practices in constructing masculine identities. So in the forms of, in my migrants' men life, they take on a lot of domestic chores or basically housework or practices that might be considered non-masculine or feminine in some ways. But for them, it is a practice of making them more independent as men, more mature as men. So it is not about rejecting, but also now there is a transition into embodying as well.
thank you. Nicolas, you also wanted to say something.
Yes, so my research is basically the same as in Robert's research. It's always implicitly there. What I discovered, or when I researched masculinity in the early 20th century and how it changes in China in relation to foreign concepts of masculinity, you kind of see how these notions of masculinity and femininity, they shift a lot. So this crisis of masculinity in the early 20th century in China came from that earlier concepts of what counted as masculine basically in China was viewed as feminine by Europeans and Americans. And I think the same is true for Korea and Japan at the time. And so you can basically see how masculinity changes because of these changing perceptions, what is feminine and what is masculine. And because of these shifts influenced by foreign influences, you kind of have new conceptions of masculinity.
Can I add on to that?
Please, Sylvia.
Yeah, so with regards to femininity, I found that with my low-wage male respondents, Chinese respondents, they actually express their worries and anxiety on intimacies very generously. And I think that emotionality actually suggests a possible shift in Chinese masculinities. And I think, conventionally we think of, masculinity as defined by the lack of emotions, but this was really counter to that. And in fact, I think because of their low wage status, their low class status, they might actually be more flexible in their masculinities than relative to other classes. And in that sense, they actually may share, I think, possible, optimistically from my perspective, the potential to understand or share some of the struggles of many women in Asia and China, is what I think.
Thank you, Sylvia. And then we have one more question from the audience by Carolyn Beck, PhD student at the University of Sheffield. And she writes, my own research looks at negotiations of hegemonic masculinity and femininity through dress in contemporary Japan. One of the panelists has briefly mentioned dress and clothing, but I was wondering whether any of the panelists noticed or even further looked at how dress plays into the negotiation of masculinity. Does anyone want to respond to that? Nicolas?
Yeah, so I mean, in my research, it plays a huge role because the whole shift of how you conceptualize masculinity is very much related to performance, to behavior, and to dress. So in the early 20th century, you have all of a sudden in China, you have people who are wearing military uniforms, very close-cut dresses, which are very different from what you used to wear in China in the 19th century, long gowns, and so on and so forth, long hair. So this plays a huge role. I think you cannot really discuss masculinity without performance. And performance is obviously related to bodily behavior, I think, and also to dress. So for my own research, it plays a huge role how people change to dress. It affects a lot how they conceptualize masculinity.
Do you have a concrete example, just to be, if you have, from your research? Would be interesting to know. If you have one, if not, nothing comes to mind at the moment. It's totally fine.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about a military officer in 19th century China, they used to wear long dresses, long gowns, and now they introduced these these European or German, actually German, Japanese, European uniforms, which are very closely cut, and then you can see the body much more. It's much more obvious body parts and how you move, and that kind of started a huge discussion of about the body and what you can actually see, what you're supposed to see. It changes how you move and how you behave and how you conduct yourself. It affects a lot of your own ideas of self-discipline and bodily self-discipline. And all these things kind of relate to a new conception of masculinity that is actually related to physical education, to martial values. Martial spirit is a huge, is a big concept at the time, martial spirit, and so on and so forth. So it kind of opens up a huge new kind of characteristics, what a man is supposed to be and how he's supposed to behave. And the way you dressed affected a lot how you could actually move. And that kind of changes the whole idea what a man is in at the time, you know. And I think, yeah, of course, it still has a lot of effects today, and a bit different, but also I think dress is very important. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Okay, we have one final question from the audience, and we slowly have to come to our final statements for today. Hannah Jans from Goethe Institute Tokyo is asking, I'm interested in the recent influence and impact of digitalization on masculinities. Have you observed maybe culturally specific trends regarding the performance of masculinity in digital spaces? It's also something that I thought when you talked about WeChat earlier, for example, as a tool to communicate, but also to perform in a sense. So, but any one of you, do you want to respond to that digitization, digital performance of masculinity. Shumin? Or are you? Okay. Anyone?
I think from my case, it is very obvious in a way that similar to Sylvia's, her participants use WeChat. My participants use Facebook as a dominant platform to perform certain aspects of their masculinities. So basically, but the question is who they perform to. And they mostly, the way I see it, is performing to family members and friends and social networks back home in Vietnam. And they would perform their masculinities in a way that they survive the new living environments in Japan. They survive the challenges of migrations. As like now they post about their work, they show off their linguistic skill or newly acquired linguistic skill. They show off the way, well, related to dress as well, they show off the way that they dress with like new trends of Japanese fashion trends. And they use Facebook a lot to tell people or to show that, yeah, I am a kind of man of modernity. I am a migrant, successful migrant man, but mostly on Facebook. And they also, some of my informants also use a lot of dating apps in order to, well, it's more related to sexualities, but the ways in which they show off their masculinities on the dating apps is also another very interesting aspect that if scholars look into sexuality and masculinity can tease out a lot from that.
Thanks a lot. Okay, with this, I would like to come to our last question to all of you for today. As said at the beginning, so this is in the context of International Women's Day, so that also means thinking about what this research can actually do in real life. I mean, every kind of research stands on its own, and we as historians especially also know that you know, we can't really learn from history, but still I think all of you have thought about what does this research mean in terms of creating an inclusive society, gender equality, and so on. So I want to ask if anyone has any insights on that, what your research means in a sense. Nicolas.
Me again. No, I just wanted to say, for a historian, of course, it's not important very much for everyone what Chinese men in the early 20th century did, I guess. But what you can actually learn from this historical research on masculinity is that masculinity and femininity and are historically constructed. And I think it's a very, very important to show that during different times, different spaces, you have different conceptions of masculinity, of masculinities, in the plural at the time, at the same time, in different spaces. So for, in my case, early 20th century China, there are various concepts of masculinity, and you can actually see how they develop, how they evolve, how they change. And I think that helps a lot to think about these gender concepts in general today, and keep in mind that these things are historically constructed, that they change. I think Hue has said a lot about it earlier, and the others as well, how these concepts are changing, that they are not like biologically given, that they're not natural, and that they change over time. And that also helps, I think, with changing society, and especially when you consider women's rights and equality.
Thank you very much. There's nods from the other speakers, so I think it's a last final statement, also given the time. So I would like to conclude this session for today. Thank all of the speakers very much for your time, for your insights, for your expertise, for joining tonight, this morning. And I'd also like to thank the audience for staying with us throughout this session. And yeah, thanks again, and I'm wishing you a great evening. Thank you.